asking, is it the case that the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Services, known as NATSLs, will be entirely without federal funding at some point over the forward estimates?
Sorry, say that again, Senator?
Is it the case that NATSLs will be entirely without federal funding at some point over the forward estimates?
Has that decision been made?
I don't think we can say that.
Why would that be, Senator?
Well, I'm not sure, except that there's concern among the sector because of this push to about frontline services versus...
You can't ask the Minister or the officers about concern people might have. If there's been an announcement of cutbacks...
Well, there has been an announcement that there is going to be a funding cut to the policy and advocacy aspects of Indigenous legal funding.
Do you mean...
NATSLs are predominantly an organisation that does that. I'm asking whether or not they will be without federal, whether they will be defunded
is it the
at
government's,
some point over the forward
you're saying,
estimates.
is it the government's intention to cut funding to ATSLs?
Well, is it going to happen, is what I'm asking.
Senator, I think I can say that that consequence doesn't necessarily follow from the decisions that have been made.
Right. So it doesn't necessarily follow, and no decision's been made at this point that would point to that?
Well, there are decisions that have been made. Your conclusion doesn't necessarily follow, and there are still decisions that will be made by government in due course.
All right. As the national peak body for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander legal services, to what extent has the government consulted with NATSLs about issues affecting over the last, let's say 5 years, about issues affecting Indigenous people, policy formation and other lines of inquiry in relation to the justice sector? Has the government consulted with NATSLs?
Senator, I think I can say that this department has a very strong relationship with NATSLs and consults when possible and has traditionally done that.
All right, thank you for that. And to what extent has the government made reference to NATSL's submissions to government? NATSLs has made submissions at different times in relation to Indigenous law policy and law reform?
So government, this department, will always take into account submissions that are received.
All right, thank you. So are you confirming that NATSLs have in fact made submissions at different times in relation to Indigenous law policy and reform?
Senator Greg Manning, First Assistant Secretary, Access to Justice Division. That's my understanding that they have. I've only been in this position since the end of November, but I've met with NATSLs recently and they have explained to me that they've made numerous submissions on different topics. All
right, could I ask you to take on notice over the last 5 years, the submissions that they've made in terms of the area that we've just been discussing, please? Thank you.
Sorry, you mean just in relation to legal assistance?
Well, in relation to Aboriginal law, policy and reform issues.
That's what I thought. I'm not sure they can do that. So the Department of the Environment, for example, would have received submissions.
Perhaps
I don't think, Senator, I'm going to go and ask.
No, all right. I would imagine that it would generally be about law, given that it's the Aboriginal and Islander Legal Services, but perhaps we'll confine it to the areas of law reform and policy affecting Indigenous people.
I think it's law reform and policy across government. I'm not going to be able to answer that in any time soon.
What do you think you could answer then,
with respect, 5
Mr.
years
Wilkins?
seems to be an unreasonable call upon the department.
Well, I'd ask the department to put that to me if that's the case, Chair.
13-14 budget.
What I'm interested in knowing and understanding, and I think you can understand where my question's coming from, is that what services, what value, what has been obtained from this organisation, and the nature of that, not just some general, yes, they've made numerous submissions, but what submissions and how often? And because the question then will be, if they're not able to continue to make those submissions, where will the government receive that unique view about the implications of changes to law on Aboriginal people in the legal sector?
Look, I'm not going to even allow the question. We are short of time. If they're rejected from making submissions,
they're not, Chair. I'm just asking, this is a reasonable question to ask. No, it's not. I'm asking specifically what submissions NATSLs have made in the area of, well, let's say in relation to...
All right, well, you've asked that and it's been taken on notice.
Well, I'm not sure that it has, because you've suggested that they've said no. Do you understand the question, Mr. Wilkins? Do you understand what I'm asking?
I do, and I don't think it's a tractable questions, with all due respect, Senator. I'm happy to look at my own department to see what submissions they've made to my department.
That would be certainly of assistance.
But not the whole of the government.
No, all right. Thank you for clarifying that. I'm happy to have that discussion about what is reasonable and what isn't.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
I'm interested now in knowing, and this is a question that was asked at the last estimates, has the government now assessed the likely impact of reducing funding for Indigenous legal services on the disproportionate representation of Indigenous people in Australia's prisons? Because I asked last time, had there been any modelling by the department or any forecasting about what the effects of these cuts might be on Indigenous incarceration rates?
Have you made an assessment is the question?
No.
Okay.
No, nothing further?
Senator Wright, because we have asked that the savings be found in the policy and advocacy function, then we wouldn't expect that it would have any effect at all. However, if your question is, has an empirical study been done? No, but the savings have been very carefully designed to protect against that eventuality.
Well, can I ask then a clarifying question on that? Is community legal education part of frontline services, or is that part of law reform policy and advocacy?
It all depends. I know this is a slightly unhelpful answer, but it all depends upon the circumstances. I really would be struggling to give you a yes or no answer to that question. It may be.
And you can understand why that question is very important, because
Sure.
arguably, if there are reductions in community legal education, that very much might translate into an effect on incarceration rates in terms of people's understanding about the law and how to avoid getting into trouble with the law.
Senator Wright, potentially, and you're absolutely right. It would be great to be able to spend a lot more in the access to justice area. I would like to spend a lot more in the access to justice area. Unfortunately, the government has no money because it was all spent by the previous government, and the country was left with $400 billion of public debt.
All right, I'll put the other questions on.